Please welcome Barbara Holmes.
Hello, I'm Barbara Holmes. I'm a spiritual teacher, writer, seeker, and a faculty member at the Center for Action and Contemplation. I'm talking to you today about how a lifetime of mystery and divine encounters inspired me to teach. And by this I mean that from birth to this day, I find myself in thin places, geo-spiritual spaces where I experience God unfiltered. In these spaces where great beauty runs rampant, I contemplate the artistry of the Divine One who beckons me around bodies of water. Water, whether lake or ocean, river or stream, reminds me of my baptism, reminds me of my birthing story, and reminds me to gratefully pour libations for those who've gone before. So I'm going to begin this conversation with the ritual pouring of libations. Libations are poured in many cultural contexts, but from an African perspective, it's not just symbolic, it's also practical. It is believed that libations restore the balance of energy between living beings and the non-corporeal and spirit world. It also honors the elders who've gone before and represent our love and support for all they did to pave the way for us. It also is a way of honoring the spirit and changing the energy between life forms so that we can bless them and they can bless us. A gift for a gift, a mercy for a mercy, a love for a love. And so I pour. I pour for those who teach and learn. I pour for times of breaking and disorder. I pour for healing and the rising of a new order. Water is life-giving, life-sustaining, a gift to humankind. And I've always believed that waters must flow for something new to be born. And that's the context of my own birthing story. I was told that when my mother's water didn't break during labor, and when her doctor decided to let nature take its course, her life and mine were in peril. My mother had been in labor for days and was getting weaker. I was blue from the lack of oxygen. As the doctor left the room, a nurse entered and using a sharp instrument broke my mother's water, saving both of us. My mother had never seen the nurse before and she wanted to thank her. So she described the nurse to a staff member who said that no one of her description worked there and that she'd been right outside my mother's door and no one had entered the room after the doctor left. Thin places. Thin places are direct, they can be perceived, they can be internal. Not all of my places, my thin places, are external. Within I'm a vast, watery landscape where heaven and earth meet. Beyond me there are even more dimensions and worlds just beyond my reach. And so I teach. I can't unravel the mysteries, but I can teach to transcend. I can teach so that others can hear, and I can teach so that people are comfortable being who they are. So I'm a witness as I meander teaching through the life continuum, and so are you. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a few questions about your own spiritual practices. Consider this. Have you experienced a thin place? Have you had an encounter with God? What happened? Have you recorded the incident? Take a moment when you have time to journal, write poetry, use art or movement to seal that memory into your mind and your spirit. Here's a second thing you can do for location of internal thin places. Locate an area in your body that is what I'm going to call thin. It'll be a place of sensitivity, of perception, and intuition. Send a message to that space of gratitude, share any concerns you may have, and offer commitments of care. We are explorers in these same places without a map because there are no maps on the life journey. But I do have one for today's conversation. I'm going to be talking to you in 4 sections, and here are the sections: experiencing God, exploring thin places, and teaching beyond boundaries, and finally, embracing continuums. Our first topic is experiencing God. And the question that begins this conversation is this: have you had an experience of God's presence that ignited your passion to teach? That's the question I was asked. And my answer is I've had many over the years. They've just become clearer and more frequent as my values changed and my needs and my wants decreased. I've learned to be still so that messages can get through the cultural noise and the distractions of life. My experiences with God are embodied physically and emotionally. And although my Christian beliefs attune me to certain spiritual experiences, I'm also open to an interplay of multiple wisdom traditions. What that means for me is that Western limits on reality don't foreclose the miracle of divine encounter. So how do I experience God? Well, as a unifying principle in the universe, as a felt presence in my everyday life, and as a messenger in dreams. So what are the spiritual contexts for these experiences? Well, I've experienced God in powwow, Sufi dances, during communion, during Islamic calls to prayer. I have experienced God while escorting elders and others to the horizon that separates this life from the life beyond life. I've experienced God as a steady knowing through the teachings of the church. And in nature, God is present as I ponder the mystical communication of trees and the intelligence of deep sea creatures. Often, I also have a sense of God's abiding presence while in community, among colleagues, among family, and among friends. Because after all, it was because of them sharing their bizarre encounters, their healings, their miraculous interventions, their warnings from beyond the veil, and the comings and goings of ancestors that expanded my view of what life was really like. So what happens is that the stories of the elders provide containers for the mystery of encounter. And they also provide experiential and scriptural guardrails for assessing the origin of the event. Nobody trusts the solitary experience of God without the moorings of community, ancestral memory, biblical example. The elders, as it turns out, could discern genuine experiences of God from mental health issues or cries for attention. So it's necessary to have a community through which you filter, and I call that elder wisdom. So although I've had many experiences, I want to share a particular sacred experience in a very thin place, my grandmother's house. This experience is from my childhood, but it was so intense and so real that I remember it in detail to this day. It was a cold winter day in the Northeast, and I was in my grandmother's wonderful ramshackle house that leaned this way and that way, except for the fact that it was situated smack dab in the middle of Newark, New Jersey, It could have been the cottage in the woods that Hansel and Gretel discovered. Central heat was a futuristic hope. This little house was heated by a red-hot coal stove that was located in the kitchen. The kitchen was a gathering place in my granny's house. It was a tight space permeated with the smells of scratch cooking and the laughter of hard-working adults. Because I had been severely burned on my arm on the stove while playing near it on a previous visit, I was sent to the living room to entertain myself. The burn was treated with prayers and homemade salves. It was healing well, but my mother was taking no chances. I was about 7 or 8 years old at the time, and I loved playing on the small hassock in my grandmother's living room. It was compact, and it was just the right height for leaping and crawling. And so on this particular evening, I was playing on the hassock when something very strange happened. I can only report what I remember, and my memories may be flawed by the passage of time and by the overwhelming nature of the sensory experience. Although I may have fallen asleep, I had no sense of being awake or asleep. Instead, I became aware in a hypersensitive way of a sound that was recognizable to me as music, but at the same time, it was more than music. It was a sound that tuned my soul, and it alerted me to the fact that nothing was happening in an ordinary way. For one thing, I was no longer on the hassock. I was floating toward the ceiling in a slow and circular movement that delighted me. I should have been scared because I could see my slumped body still on the hassock. But I wasn't afraid at all. I was happy to the point of bursting, and to top off this sense of euphoria, my beloved deceased Aunt Grace was there. Now, I didn't see her, but I knew she was nearby, and her closeness to me made me even happier. As I floated toward the ceiling, I thought about calling the adults in the next room, but I had no speech. There was no sense of distress as I approached the ceiling, but I knew that if I did nothing, I would pass through it and leave the earth forever. There was only a moment of conflict as I contemplated what it would mean not to be a child, what it would mean to turn to the hassock and to my supine body. I remember a farewell from my Aunt Grace, the fading of the music that was more than music, and then my speech returned. I was elated. I was breathless as I ran to the next room to report to the adults that I flew, and Aunt Grace was playing with me. The mention of my deceased aunt stopped everything. See, most families would have poo-pooed my account of flying and visitations from a dead relative, but my family has roots in the Gullah culture of South Carolina on my father's side and the Maryland Eastern Shore mystics on my mother's, so they share a belief. Everybody knows that the dead come back. They come back and forth to offer warnings, to bring messages from the other side. I was quizzed by the elders, and when I couldn't come up with any deep wisdom or any important message from the other side, the mood in the room returned to joviality, and I was told, "Oh, you were asleep. It was nothing, maybe a dream." But even then I had the sense that this was intended to ease my mind. The game of pinochle resumed. The pots were stirred. But one aunt said rather pointedly, "Let us know if she comes to you again." There it was. I had received affirmation. Aunt Grace had been there and might come again. I held this experience and these details in my memory until I wrote about it a few years ago. My sister was reading the manuscript, and she didn't realize that I'd had that experience and she had too. She said, "It happened to you too?" I listened and heard for the first time her story of walking to school alone, suddenly having reality shift as she was lifted from the concrete sidewalk. Everything around her in freeze frame did not resume motion until she drifted slowly back to the ground. She never told anyone. I told my story to anybody who would listen. So why do I consider this occurrence an experience of God? Because anything is possible when the divine is in everything and everything is in the divine. Because the event occurred in my grandmother's house, a thin place of prayer and laughter and spiritual power, where she dispensed ointments, root remedies, and relied upon God's healing grace. I told you her story during my teaching of everyday mysticism. Briefly, she was diagnosed with a fatal cancer midlife, but did not die until 90. The doctors who cared for her at the end said that the tumor was still in her tummy, but was miraculously encased with a membrane that rendered it harmless. It is in the thin places where power concentrates, where the sacred may penetrate the ordinary, where the veil between the worlds is thin. Even during this telling of the encounter, I can kind of feel the energy of divine presence. We live in a world saturated with the love and intentionality of an ever-present God, and we are not alone. Let's move to our second topic, exploring thin places. I first heard the term thin places within the context of Celtic, Irish, and Scottish spirituality. The reference is to actual places where the boundaries between heaven and earth melt away, and the boundaries between this world and other worlds disappear. In such places, contact with divine transformation, unusual occurrences are reported. Moreover, the energy of these places seem to differ from our normal spaces. Of course, for those who don't believe you need to have a geographic space, the coming of Jesus, the universal Christ, is part of who we are, and we don't have to have special locations. Our bodies are temples for the Holy Spirit, a fitting place for a thin encounter. But those who argue that geography matters also say the energy, the mysticism in these spaces cannot be denied. Locations like Lourdes, Iona, the Rift Valley, and Mount Sinai, to name just a few. So, if you're concerned about, the pouring of libations and these weird occurrences, you want to go back to the Bible and you're going to say, well, what does the Bible say about thin places? Well, there are more thin places in the Bible than I've ever heard of anywhere else. These are experiences of God that include voiced messages, symbolic manifestations, and events in the natural world that defy explanation. Let's take a moment to just examine one in the Hebrew Bible and one in the New Testament. So the one in the Hebrew Bible, Daniel 3:24-25, refers to a thin place in the middle of a fiery furnace. When King Nebuchadnezzar had a statue of himself built and decreed that all subjects had to worship it, three Hebrew men, refused, saying they could only worship the true God, Yahweh. You know the story. The king ordered them burned in an especially hot furnace, but they didn't perish in the flames. And what Scripture says is, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, was it not 3 men we threw bound into the fire? And they answered the king, true, O king. And he replied, but I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they're not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god. In this familiar story, the furnace becomes a thin place, a place of encounter and refuge, where God is with us. Have you ever considered the possibility that your time of testing or anguish may be a thin place where you are closer to the divine than in any other situation. Now we go to the New Testament, the Synoptic Gospels that describe the Transfiguration. And this is an event where Jesus leads Peter, James, and John to a thin place as Jesus talks with dead prophets, Elijah and Moses. And they hear the voice of God from within a cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen. In him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And they were changed forever. The path of faith may lead you into thin places, where you may encounter a source of wisdom that far exceeds what you've been exposed to thus far. Are you ready to listen and obey? If, like Moses, you encounter a bush that is burning but not consumed, and you hear a voice that says, "Take off your shoes, you're on holy ground," you'll know that you're in a thin place. But will you know that you're in thin places if the signs are more subtle? Edges of what is known and what is not, where anything is possible. But these spaces don't exclusively belong to one faith group or another. Here's what happens. In thin places, we're jolted from routines and expectations into awareness. In thin places, there can be contact from beyond the veil. Reporters kept saying that George Floyd was calling for his dead mother, and they were saying at the sight of his death, now he's talking to her. I believe that the sight of George Floyd's execution was a thin space. I believe that because his mother had recently passed. And he wasn't just talking, he was actually talking to his mother, who was acting as a source of comfort and guidance. So why do these thin places occur? I don't believe we have these experiences of God just for the delight or the drama of it. It's for the edification of the people. My God encounters help me to grow, to prepare for the life that I now live. Help me to resist the push for upward mobility that was a goal of every middle-class African-American family when I was growing up. So how did I stop the striving? Through encounters with God that changed my view of the world. I grew up in the UCC, and I didn't have a container there big enough to hold all the mysteries that I was experiencing. Moreover, in the role that I felt that I should be doing, I didn't see any women leading or teaching or sharing mystical experiences. And so on high, holy days, I would find myself sitting in the back of Catholic churches or attending Greek Orthodox rituals. I went to places where mystery was welcomed. It wasn't until my sojourn with Pentecostals that things began to make sense. There were women leading ministry. Mystery was encouraged. Ordinary people operating out of their gifts. Storefront Pentecostal churches were thin places for me where I could really feel my religion. Many of the churches that I followed were fivefold ministries or out of Ephesians 4:11 through 13 churches. They were organized according to the structure found in Scripture, where it says, "It was God who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, some to be pastors and teachers, to prepare God's people for works of service for the body of Christ." So everyone in my little church in Dallas, where I was attending, wanted to be something powerful and commanding and like a prophet or something, which defeated the purpose of Christian downward mobility. We were just all trying to figure out what our gifts were. So I started calling myself an evangelist. Well, little did I know that the title required certain gifts I didn't have. If you were an evangelist in a Pentecostal church, you had to know songs. A lot of songs. I mean, past the first verse. You had to have a good voice. You had to be able to rally the crowd. You had to have a boldness. And And showmanship. You wanted to be the center of attention. I didn't. I was shy. So I pretty quickly stopped calling myself an evangelist after being embarrassed a couple of times with a lot of humming and no verses to songs. See, this was all happening at the same time that I was practicing law in Dallas. And I didn't know what my calling was, and I really wanted to know. And then one day, when I was reading scripture, I had been assigned to teach Bible school. I had a revelation of what it meant that I shouldn't have had. I had no background, I hadn't been to seminary yet, and I taught at Bible school, and it was powerfully received. So I guess that I'd have to leave the prophets, evangelists, and apostles to other people. I was a teacher. But nothing happens rapidly, so I practiced law for a couple of more years until basically the law firm imploded. I was in Miami, the city of my dreams. Because what I forgot about was that lawyers don't just fight for people and against other people, they fight with each other. And so without a lot of notice, the firm closed. At the same time, my mom called, asked me to come home to help with my grandmother who was dying. I was being drawn away from the life I had planned for the life I was being called to. So I went home, and after Granny passed, I stayed to help my mom. And I knew that if I went back and practiced law in Atlanta, I was licensed there, that I wouldn't ever turn away. So I didn't. My mother tolerated my not working. I decided to volunteer at a children's home just a few blocks from my mom's house. But when I walked into the building, I missed the Gothic lettering. There was a children's home. It was next door. I was walking into a seminary, one of the wealthiest Presbyterian seminaries in the South. I was not a Presbyterian. I had no money for tuition. I didn't have a job. But I walked in, they signed me to attend, full scholarship, and so it began. See, what I'm trying to convey is that there is a fullness to these experiences that is very hard to explain. It wasn't just mystery and smoke and mirrors and drama. After each experience, when I least expected it, loose ends were tied up, obstacles were removed from my path. People spoke into my life, called me to my highest good, made a way out of no way. After seminary, doctoral studies followed, and I found myself equipped to teach. These experiences and the postgraduate education that was offered to me ignited a passion to teach beyond boundaries. And so we come to our third topic of conversation, a passion ignited, teaching beyond boundaries. My concern about education has always been that we teach our children to ignore or diminish their spiritual gifts. We line them up at school, teach them to raise their hands, not just for order, but also to encourage groupthink and a culture of conformity. Professor Noe Rooks, in her book Cutting School, Privatization, Segregation, and the End of Public School, presents research to support her theory that poor BIPOC, Latinx, marginalized children do not get the same education that white, middle, and upper class children get. Moreover, they are subject more often to experimental teaching theories and practices. She uses an example of Philadelphia where she says 20% of the children get their entire education online and are failing national tests at an alarming rate. So I went to those same regimented schools where I had to line up to eat and line up for this and that, but I lived in a multi-generational household. So it was too late by the time I enrolled in kindergarten to root out the creativity, the mystical orientation that pervaded my growing up years. So how have my experiences of God in the thin places influenced my teaching? What I think I'm doing is preparing people to operate fully in their gifts. What I'm trying to do is use my own life as an example that allows intersecting in multiple realities, not just one agreed upon cultural perspective. And I'm also hoping to encourage the risk of embodying both action and contemplation. When I'm teaching, I'm witnessing to the wonder of a created order that I didn't create. It's God's work that we're privileged to participate in. As a teacher, I try to offer not just what I learned from books or from others, but I try to teach through my own encounters with a living God. So, in order for you to know how I was taught, how I'm teaching you, you need to take a look at the teachers who modeled for me witness, activism, and contemplation. So here are my teachers. Time is not going to permit me to discuss all the people you will see depicted on the slide, but I do want you to know who they are. On the left of the slide is Marcia, Dr. Marcia Y. Riggs, an ethicist who welcomed me to seminary and to womanism. And then Dr. Victor Anderson, philosopher, who taught me the relevance of history and taught me how to find my place within its flow. Then, of course, there's Father Richard Rohr, who invited me to engage with the universal Christ in a God-soaked world. At the bottom, you'll see David Bohm, physicist, who introduced the idea of an implicate and an explicate order and the wholeness underlying absolutely everything. To the right, you will see my dear late friend, Ada Maria Asasi Diaz, who empowered Latinx women and mujeristas to find their voices. Of these times that we are living in, we are the only witnesses that future generations will have. Our lives are the lessons. When it comes to teaching as action, activism, I turn to bell hooks. She describes education as a practice of freedom. In her book, Teaching to Transgress, she says this, quote, "With these essays, I add my voice to the collective call for renewal and rejuvenation in our teaching practices, urging all of us to open our minds and hearts so that we can know beyond the boundaries of what is acceptable, so that we can think and rethink, so that we can create new visions." She says, "I celebrate teaching that enables transgressions, a movement against and beyond boundaries." It's that movement which makes education the practice of freedom. When I want to consider action and justice-oriented teaching, bell hooks reminds me that before I can even teach such powerful practices, I also have to practice freedom in my own life. I have to be honest about my own anger, about the ways that things are. I have to be willing to seek remedies that will redeem all, even those who harm and kill. Next is Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman says this, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do that. Because what the world needs are more people who have come alive." Howard Thurman, an African-American contemplative leader born 1899, he dies in 1981, gets to the heart of the matter. Determine what you want really, and then come alive to the possibility of a life of faith and risk and authenticity. Through Howard Thurman's contemplative spirit, we invite our students to explore the portals to the source of their being. Just enough to quell their fears, just enough to sustain them on the journey, and more than enough to ignite the passion to live at the center of God's will. Now we turn to Mandela. From Mandela, I learned that my time is not God's time. Years in prison for Mandela did not mean that God did not have a specific plan for his life. It just didn't play out in the ways in which we expected it to. The next slide is Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. And from my late friend, I learned to do the work that my soul must have. She said, do the work your soul must have. Do the work that makes your spirit leap for joy. Beloved, who are your teachers? What have you learned from them? And what will you pass on? We come to the final topic, embracing continuums. Teaching for transcendence means embracing continuum cycles of wholeness and fragmentation, as well as connections that link us to our ancestors and to one another. I've arrived at a place of spiritual well-being, not because of some holy intention on my part, but because the mythology of upward mobility was a delusion I couldn't sustain even if I'd wanted to. I know only a few things. I know that when Jesus said, I will never leave you alone, that was a promise I could rely on. We don't get out of this life alive. For most of us, damage and trouble comes with it. I'm not whole. I'm not completely healed. But what would be the fun of that? It's in the journey, in the shared struggle, that I find solace. My teaching plumbs deep wells that I did not dig. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I teach because I need to share what I've learned. I teach to reconnect folks to the extended space, history, ancestors, lineage, and guides. I teach to inspire. I try to teach beyond what I've been taught, inviting others to abide in thin places. I teach because my learning has been a dance with mystery. So I've been talking a lot about thin places. And you now may be wondering, how do I get to a thin place? Well, I turned to Eric Weiner's excellent article, When Heaven and Earth Kiss. Weiner says this, quote, you stumble upon one. To some extent, thinness is like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. Travel to thin places doesn't necessarily lead to anything as grandiose as a spiritual breakthrough, whatever that means. But it does disorient. It confuses. We lose our bearings and we find new ones, or not. Either way, we are jolted out of old ways of seeing the world. My sojourns in thin places have opened my eyes. I have gratefully lost my bearings. Sometimes I found new ones, sometimes I didn't. Your thin place may or may not be mine. For this, I'm grateful, for how else could I learn from your experience, unsettle my certainties, and embark anew on the journey toward mystical union. Ashe.